Hello again. Chase the Traveler with a new episode. So, a lot of you have asked me this question. A lot of you have wanted to know, why is it so difficult for foreigners to leave Japan if they want to leave Japan? Now, a lot of you think it's a simple thing. Okay, well, I want to leave Japan, so I'm going to leave Japan. In reality, it's not that simple. It's not that easy. There are multiple layers of things that you have to do in order to leave. And you can't really leave unless you're prepared. So let me tell you a few stories. Now, if you've been here for a couple of years, let's say 2, 3, 4, 5 years, it gets extremely more difficult to go back. If you're from the United States, all of a sudden you spend 3 years, 5 years overseas and you're trying to go back. You're going to find yourself in a situation where you probably haven't built up any credit. You probably haven't rented an apartment. You haven't worked. So now, you're in Japan and you're trying to go back home without any credit history whatsoever. I know a guy who spent 13 years over here. He basically saved up some money. He thought he was ready to go back home. He thought he was prepared. Actually, this guy had enough money to buy a house outright. He went to the bank, asked the bank to get a loan. He said, well, look, I need a loan. I want a secured loan, meaning that he has enough money to be able to repay it. Well, of course, the problem was that he didn't have employment in the States. He had quit his job in Japan. So because he had quit his job in Japan, of course he did have money to pay for the house. But they wouldn't let him borrow any money. He said, you know something? I'm going to put 20% down, 30% down for the house. They offered him like the highest interest rate on the planet. It was like 3 times more than the normal rate. So of course he refused. So imagine that. You want to buy a house. You have all the money. You're asking for a secured loan. You're not going to get it. So that's the problem that he ran into. So eventually he ended up having to buy his house cash. So now he bought his house cash. So now he didn't have any money left. He had a house, but no money. So now it's time to look for a job. Now, looking for a job might seem easy, might seem doable because, again, people have a very, very positive image of Japan. So now you speak Japanese. So you're thinking, man, I speak Japanese. I must have some really... my resume is going to be hot. But in reality, your resume doesn't mean anything. What happened to him was he tried to get jobs with like small little Japanese companies. But of course, they weren't going to hire him because they could find a Japanese person that spoke better Japanese than him, even though his Japanese was pretty good. So they'd rather hire the Japanese person who spoke broken English over a foreigner who spoke Japanese. Because again, if you're in the States, American people don't care about that. But if you're in Japan, Japanese people do want you to be Japanese in order to do business with you most of the time, not all the time. So therefore, he pretty much wasn't able to get the job that he wanted, even though he was in a house that was fully paid for. So now you ask yourself, that's one of the situations that you're going to run into after being here for a long time, is that you're pretty much disconnected from society. You're pretty much disconnected from the society that you're from. You don't have any credit history. So people kind of like need an explanation. They want to make sure that you haven't been in jail for a number of years. And another problem that you're going to run into is people are going to think that, hey, you were in Japan. You made enough money to buy a house outright. Why didn't you stay there? What are you coming back over here for? People in other countries don't understand the burden that you had to go through or the hardships that you had to go through in order to do what you did. So you're kind of stuck. It's kind of difficult to explain every single situation that you've gone through. So now you have no employment history in the States, which a lot of people don't understand that America is all about, I mean, it's about the college degree to a certain degree, but it's more about the experience. It's more about the work experience. So you spend 5 years, 10 years getting work experience from a job that has from a job that basically isn't really helping you get any kind of relevant experience that you will need when you go back home. So now, it's tough. So a lot of people are going to be in kind of a situation. So it makes it difficult to adjust when you get back home. Another problem that you're going to have is you're kind of like almost forced to buy a house because you can't rent. You cannot rent because in order to rent a place, you need a certain type of credit score. And you're not going to get that credit score if you've been sitting around in another country for a number of years. So while you're sitting around in Japan or wherever it is that you are for a number of years, you're going back and you're trying to get an apartment. All of a sudden, you fill out the application and they want you to make 3 times the amount of rent that you're going to be paying. Well, now, you can go to the landlord and say, you know something, I've got money in the bank. But then, this is America. Do you really want to show them how much money you have in the bank? Probably not. So you go and say, you know something, I can afford it, even though I'm not making 3 times the rent, but give me a chance. Most people are not going to give you that chance. They want you to look good on paper. So even if you don't have as much money in the bank as somebody else, if you have, or if you fit the criteria, then you're good to go. So I have a friend who, again, he ran into problems trying to get an apartment because when he came back, he didn't want to live where he was from. He couldn't get an apartment where he wanted to go in order to look for work because he didn't make 3 times the amount that they wanted him to make. He didn't have the credit history. So now, it's almost as if he wasn't really a person anymore. So what he ended up doing was making a deal with one of the landlords, a really small landlord. Hey, you know something? I know I don't fit the criteria, so let me pay you a year in advance, which again, most people don't do. But then he was kind of forced to pay a year in advance for rent because he didn't fit the criteria on paper that he needed to fit in order to get the apartment that he needed to get. So now, a lot of people looking at this, and half the time you don't want to explain the situation over and over and over and over again. So people think you're kind of like suspicious. You're a little shady. Why would you do that? And when you tell them that, hey, you know something? I was living in Japan. So this is why I'm kind of like in the situation. They kind of like nod their head and say, you know something? Yeah, I believe you, but they don't really believe you. So what happened to this guy is that he ran into one of these landlords and he kind of had to sign the lease really quickly, and he came up with the money, but then she put a clause in the lease that the lease renewed automatically. And of course, if he or she wanted to release themselves from their duties in the lease, that she would have to sign it. So it was almost kind of like a predatory lease because she kind of felt his situation was a little precarious. So she had him sign a predatory lease where, get this, imagine if she didn't sign off on him leaving, then automatically now he would be in a situation where he wouldn't be able to get out of the lease. And he didn't understand that until it was time for him to move on. And then he was reading, he was like, oh, what is this? She has to sign it. Now, most leases never have language like that. So, when you're in a situation like he was, where you need housing, and you've lived overseas for many, many years, some people try to take advantage of your situation. Some people don't believe that you're saying what you're saying. And not only that, you don't have any credit history. Are you hiding something? I mean, no, he wasn't hiding anything. He was just trying to reintegrate himself back into society, back into the society where he came from. But again, employment history mattered, so that sets you back. Credit history matters. If you're sitting out here in Japan and you don't have any cards from the States, or you came here when you were too young, and you stayed here too long, now it's time for you to go back. All these things will affect the difficulties that you're going to have when you go back. So these are certain things that you're going to run into if you stay here too long, and if you don't make sure that you took care of. Another problem that people run into and people don't think about is people don't think about Social Security. All of a sudden you're in a different country. You're not paying into a pension plan. So you're not paying into a pension plan. So what are you going to do when you go home? I mean, the Japanese pension, I mean, you know, if you're from some of these places in Europe, or if you're from the States, even if you paid the Japanese pension plan, you're probably only getting 7 or 8,000, probably 6,500, depending on what the yen is doing. 6,500 a year, that's your pension right there. Yes, that is your pension. No matter how much money you pay into the system in Japan, you're getting a flat rate back, and it's very, very small. So imagine getting the Japanese pension and going back home and trying to live off of that. It ain't gonna happen. You're not gonna be living off the Japanese pension back home. So what are you gonna do? You might have to make another U-turn and come back to Japan. So these are some of the things that happen to people when they're actually trying to go back. Even the people that prepared with some money to go back, all of a sudden they're kind of like in a pickle because they can't really do what they wanted to do. I mean, the guy that saved money, another problem that you run into is that you come to Japan. I mean, back in the late 80s, early 90s, a lot of foreigners had money. They were making a lot of money in Japan. And you're making a lot of money in Japan, but they take their money, they take the money that they made in Japan and go back home with that money. The problem that they run into is that, what do you do with the money? And a lot of them end up just basically investing in crap. They don't know how to make money where they came from because they didn't really work in any industries over there. So they understand how to make money in Japan, and pretty much most of them were like in the English teaching business. I mean, obviously, some people had restaurants. If you're from India, a lot of people got into the restaurant business in Japan, doing that. But, so now, you've made money in Japan, you go back home, you don't know what to do with it. Nowadays, you can't save as much as you used to be able to save decades ago. So you're kind of like stuck. So when people say to you that, oh, well, why don't you go back home? As if it's very, very easy to go back. Actually, it's not easy to go back at all. You're going to run into a lot of problems when you go back. Because one of the problems that you're going to run into is that a lot of people don't understand Japan, don't know Japan, haven't lived in Japan, and they have this attitude as if everything is perfect and nothing can go wrong over here. And you know something? A lot of things are work in Japan. I mean, a lot of things do work. A lot of things are desirable. But that doesn't mean that you're never going to want to leave. And some people do want to leave. And some people are definitely in a situation when they try to leave. They can't leave because they can't reintegrate or readjust into the society that they came from. Some people prepared one way, but then ran into problems another way. For example, the guy, he had enough money for a house, but then he couldn't get the bank to loan him money that he already had. He had enough money to pay rent, but then his paperwork didn't pan out. So he had to pay a year in advance. And then he ran into a predatory owner who put like a weird clause in the lease. So you're going to run into job situations where, again, you don't have the employment history. You can't work in the same field. And the little bit of Japanese that you do know, there are probably Japanese people in your country that speak better Japanese than you. So you're stuck. You're stuck. So what happens? So you end up coming back. You end up giving up sometimes. And a lot of people do give up. A lot of people can't handle the culture shock because reintegrating back into the society that you know isn't as easy as you think it is. So that's really why a lot of people end up not being able to leave when they want to leave, not being able to adjust because they've disconnected themselves from the society that they came from, and the amount of work that they have to put in order to connect themselves back into that society is not only time consuming, it's sometimes outright frustrating. So of course, before you make that move, before you decide to come over here and make a life-changing decision, you need to think, because you might be stuck and you might not be able to unstick yourself from a very sticky situation. I mean, again, some people don't want to leave. That could happen too, and that's okay. But this episode is about why some foreigners who want to leave sometimes find themselves in a situation that they can't. So, Chase the Traveler, again, coming to you with another episode